Ralph Iannotti discussed a wide range of educational topics with Commissioner Ambach during the half-hour public affairs program, Face to Face. The program was broadcast by WTEN Albany on July 5th, 1981 at 11:30 a.m.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Face to Face. My name is Ralph Iannotti. Our guest today is Gordon Ambach, the New York State Commissioner of Education and the President of the University of the State of New York. Ambach was appointed to the Commissioner's post by the Board of Regents on July 1st of 1977. He first came to the Education Department in 1967 as a Special Assistant for Long-Range Planning to then State Education Commissioner Dr. James Allen.
Action News presents Face to Face. Your host is Ralph Iannotti.
Thank you for joining us today, Commissioner Ambach. It's been 14 years since you first arrived in Albany.
That's right.
And it's been just over 4 years now that you've been the Commissioner of Education. As we pointed out earlier, a few moments ago, you were appointed in July of 1977. Going into the 5th year now of your commissionership, do you think Johnny can read any better or write any better today than he could a few years ago?
I don't think there's any question about it. The test scores from throughout our state indicate that Johnny is reading better. The test scores show that mathematics is being performed more effectively. We have very good evidence in the elementary school grades as to an increase in performance. I still have some very deep concerns about our secondary level performance. The SAT scores, the scores for admissions to college, are not where they should be.
Why is that, Commissioner?
Well, you have to look at the whole pattern of testing arrangements and see that our lowest point for test scores of our students actually goes back about 7 or 8 years. At the time these children were in the 3rd grade, they were at the lowest level of our test scores. Now those same children are on up till about the 12th grade, and unfortunately that pattern of low scores has been following them. That means that for these college admission scores, they are relatively low. But you see, what's happening is the students who came through in 74, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years, had much better scores at the 3rd and the 6th grade, and I'm convinced they're going to bring us right up through the secondary level, and we'll see the SAT scores going up probably within 2 or 3 years.
What's been your biggest frustration in the past 4 years, Commissioner?
Well, I'm not sure that I'd call it as a biggest frustration, but I think that the biggest task that we've had is to make sure that we were building public confidence in education. And I am very encouraged about some of the results that we have in trying to build confidence. You know, through the course of the last 4 or 5 years, if you look at the opinion polls about confidence in education, one thing you see is that parents of children in the schools have always maintained a high level of confidence. They have. It's the adults who do not have children in schools, who had perhaps 4 or 5 years ago a relatively lower level of confidence in the schools. We're now beginning to see those attitudes pick up, and there is a greater level of confidence. And we're also beginning to see, and I can show you the evidence here with our state legislature, a substantial commitment that we have in education for our state legislature and for our state. The last 3 years, the state legislature has increased appropriations for the schools by almost $1 billion. That's an incredible commitment in a time when we've had such fiscal constraint in New York. So I've been very, very concerned about public confidence, but I also see some tremendous signs of that level of confidence coming back.
What about the commitment to education, as you referred to, on the national level? We're talking about the Reagan administration, a whole series of cutbacks, food stamps, Social Security, you name it. It's being cut back.
Well, there's no question but we're going to be facing some severe times with respect to what we have been expecting from the federal government. There are going to be reductions in education that will hit this next year. But I think there's probably one observation that's very important by way of the difference between what the President proposed and what the Congress is now doing. The President had recommended that we have a reduction of federal programs for education somewhere between 25 and 30%. The Congress didn't buy that. The Senate and the House, now still trying to resolve their differences, actually have approved expenditures for education which have reductions far less than 20 to 25%. To me, that means that at the national level, that perhaps the President misread what the Congress might do with respect to education, and that the Congress has accepted the idea of the investment in education, and that if we're going to move the economy of this country, if we're going to be certain that we have a strong quality of life and a strong economic structure, it's absolutely essential to continue to have good, solid expenditure for education. And that's what the Congress is doing right now.
The cuts aren't going to be as deep as some might fear, obviously, on the federal level. But the cuts that are made, where are New Yorkers likely to see those affecting them next year?
Well, again, it depends, of course, on what the Congress finally does with its resolution, but I could cite 2 or 3 areas where there clearly are going to be some pinches felt. One is with student aid, the loan program for students who are in higher education. We're going to be seeing a shortage of funds available. We're going to see that students will not have the same access to loans and to the guaranteed loans that they have before. Another place where we're going to see reductions is in the school breakfast and lunch programs. And that's going to mean that out-of-pocket expenses for parents will increase in order to provide for those food services. We're going to see some reductions in the remedial programs. We're going to see reductions in the research and in the innovative programs that have been funded by the federal government. Those are the places where we're going to have an immediate impact.
Isn't that dangerous, though, especially those remedial programs? Here we're talking about trying to build up that all over again, and here we're having cuts on the federal level.
Well, I hate to see it, and for 5 months I have been advocating from one end of the state to the other, and in Washington on many, many occasions, that there should not be these kinds of reductions, especially for programs of a remedial sort. The successes that I've described earlier by way of pupil performance have occurred because in our state and in other parts of the nation, we've been focusing resources on children who most need the help to learn to read, to write, and to do mathematics. And the focus of that money has paid off. The scores have gone up after we've had that kind of focus. If we're going to lose that kind of money, we're not going to be able to maintain that same level of progress with those students.
I don't want to get into a political shooting match, but do you view the Reagan administration as anti-education, Commissioner?
No, I don't. I think if they had been anti-education, they would have advocated even more severe cuts than they had advocated. But I certainly would have to note that their recommendations for reductions in education were far, far out of proportion with the rest of the reduction of the federal budget. They wanted the whole budget to be decreased by about 7.5%, but the cuts for education were 25 to 30%. And so I think education was singled out for reductions, but I also had found and worked with Secretary Bell and with other representatives of the current administration that they have not been advocating a complete wipeout of programs, but they certainly need a lot of bolstering from those of us in the states and the localities to make sure that there is a solid federal role maintained. I believe strongly in a continuing federal role for education.
We were talking a little earlier about the teaching glut not too many years ago. Somebody would go to school and get a teaching degree, and then there would be no place to teach. The schools were that full. Has that situation changed at all? Is it status quo, or do you see signs of a reversal now?
I have to give you a little trend information on this. In the course of the last 10 years, as we have been seeing a decline in enrollments in the schools, enrollments of pupils, and as we have been seeing a very tight fiscal circumstance in the schools, there has been a drop in the numbers of teachers that have been needed. And so there's been a decline in the opportunities for new graduates, and we've had a circumstance of a lot of people preparing and not many positions available. In the whole of the state of New York today, only about 2% of all the teachers are first-year teachers. That shows you how much of an experienced staff we have, but also shows you how few are coming in.
The system.
Now, my big concern is in our looking out toward about 8 or 9 years from now, because I'm terribly worried that what's going to happen is that able candidates who might be interested in teaching, they're now in secondary school, they'd be needing to go through college and graduate school and then be prepared to teach, say, in 1986 or 87. I'm very much concerned that we not discourage the talented folks who might be interested in doing that to get into teaching. And I would just urge that our talented youngsters who think they might want to teach, not be discouraged by a low intake now, but be thinking about a career that for them would begin in about 85 or 86. There are going to be opportunities
Will the
then.
job vacancies be there, though, in the
Oh,
mid-80s?
I'm quite sure they will. What's happening is that we're having more and more teachers stay longer in the teaching force. They cannot afford to retire. It's as simple as that right now. Because if they go out at this point, they're worried that their pensions will not be able to keep up with inflation. But as that teaching force grows older and older, we're going to get to the point where some of them simply will have to retire. And so I think, again, about 5 years from now, we'll have a very substantial retirement rate, and then we'll be needing an influx of new teachers, and I'm interested in top quality. If we do not, in New York State, have a top quality of program in the elementary and secondary schools, we can't build on it in our colleges or in any other of the aspects of lifelong learning that are so important.
What about the aspect of women teachers? Do you see some problem areas there also?
Well, there's no question but what the attraction and the availability for women of going into other professions has become greater and greater.
Whether it be more lucrative or other.
That's right. Clearly, better financial opportunities. In many respects, more interest in competition with men in other fields. And in many respects, there have been, and rightfully so, an opening up of opportunities in many other fields. But if one looks at college enrollments now, particularly if you look in graduate schools, in the law schools, in the business schools, in public administration, in architecture, in engineering, you'll begin to see that there's a tremendous increase in the number of women, talented women, who are entering those fields. That means they're not available for education. And that's one of the things that concerns me about 7 or 8 years from now.
While we're talking about teachers generally, just recently the Board of Regents adopted a regulation which would, in effect, expedite the disciplinary process regarding tenured teachers. There's been a lot of unhappiness about that particular regulation from the United Teachers of New York and Teachers Union officials. Give us an explanation as to why you were so much in favor of this, if you could.
I certainly will. We've proposed 2 sets of recommendations. The current procedures that we're talking about have to do with the hearings for disciplining a teacher where the school board decides that there are serious enough charges that there must be a hearing, must be an opportunity for the teacher to defend himself or herself, but then a determination as to what the penalty should be. That process, which has been in place now since 1977 in New York, it was changed in '77, has a 3-person panel making the review and then a determination. It has come to be an extraordinarily expensive process and a very time-consuming process. The average length of time for one of these hearing procedures to take place is about 360 days, the whole end-to-end process. The cost to the school board alone on these hearings has come to be in excess of $40,000 per case. That's on an average basis in the state. You have to add to that, of course, the cost to the teacher or to the union who may be defending the teacher, and then the cost to the state of New York because we pay the hearing panel cost, the transcript, and so on.
To hear the allegations and specifics.
Right. Now, all of this has gotten beyond the bounds at which it needs to be. And so we've made recommendations to the legislature that would help tighten up the process, and we also have made our new regulations that would help to tighten up the process. We've done that having in mind that there's got to be a full due process for any teacher who is involved. And we have changed only some of the procedural acts, but full due process, a right to appeal for a review of that decision to the courts or to the commissioner's office, that's still all in place.
So you're not taking away anything, you're just speeding up the process. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right.
What about the opposition? How do you counter it? You're going public and you've held news conferences about this issue, but is there anything else that can be done there?
Well, the key move, of course, is going to be in the New York State legislature. Our regulations, the changes we made, are going to be in place because we have final action there. But for the New York State legislature, the issue will be whether they agree with us on the major change we've recommended. The key change that we make or propose would be that instead of having a 3-person panel, that there be a single administrative hearing officer to hear the case. That is a practice which is used in other administrative agencies. It's a practice that's well accepted in a whole series of kinds of governmental controls and monitoring arrangements. And we think that to have a single administrative hearing officer, someone who is an employee of the education department, objective, has no direct affiliation with the local school district or indeed with the teacher or the union, can hear that case, can make that determination. We can control the schedule, we can control the cost, we can expedite it tremendously. We think it makes very good sense.
Do you see the legislature, lawmakers acting on this year, or are you hoping for the 82 session?
Well, we're running very close to the end of this part of the legislative session. And I would expect that there probably will not be action on this within the next couple of weeks, which is really the end of this part of the session. I would certainly hope, and I know there's been a considerable review of this issue with the leadership in both of the houses, and I would certainly hope that there be action in 82 if it doesn't come in 81. We just can't keep going with the circumstance of those escalating costs on these cases. And with something else which is very important here, I think there's a general public impression that it is absolutely impossible to take disciplinary action on any one teacher in the schools. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about 180 cases a year, something like that.
And how many teachers?
200,000. 180 out of 200,000. Now, that's a very, very tiny number. Each one of them's got to be dealt with due process. But I'm afraid that there is an impression about that there is not a good quality control, that we do not have adequate ways to assure quality teaching staff because the public hears about these unique cases that take so long and cost so much.
And drags on.
And drag on. And I feel very committed, one, for fairness to the teachers, not to let them drag on for them, but for the confidence of the public in education, that we streamline this process. And it will be well known to the public as to how few people there are and how our circumstance in this state is, I can say with confidence, one where we have an excellent teaching staff across the state. We've got a first-rate teaching staff and an educational system. Can't tell you how many people I meet throughout the state in various meetings will come up and say, we used to live in North Carolina. We went down to the Sun Belt to work for a while. We came back to New York. Why? Because the education that our kids were getting down in that area was just not what we were expecting. It's just not what they were accustomed to in New York, and we wanted to get back to a system and a state where, in fact, there was an expectation of high quality.
On that note, Commissioner Gordon Ambach will take a break and be right back with Face to Face. Commissioner Ambach, you've been in office now just over 4 years, in your 5th year, as of 2 days ago. We were mentioning a little while ago that probably one of the most important things to come out of the education department in recent years has been the competency testing. How is that working? Is it as successful as you thought it would be?
Competency testing program has been working very, very effectively. We started competency testing in New York back in '73 and '74. We began with a set of tests which were not really adequate. And then in '77 and '78, we began a review, and in '78 and '79, we put into place a set of tests which I had helped to develop, and we call these the Regents competency tests. They are the highest standards in the nation for expectations for reading, for writing, and for mathematics. The tests are very, very well developed. I might note that our reading test is used not only in New York, but it's now being picked up in other states across the country. And this whole program has had a tremendous impact on our state. We have raised up the expectations. What is it that we expect a pupil to do? What is a pupil to perform at the time of completion of high school? And this has had a great impact. The program's been successful. We have not had any litigation in this state to the effect of challenging that program or knocking it out. And we have had very careful reviews by Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights, with respect to the program. I'm very satisfied that in all respects we have a solid program which now has a strong support all through our school systems.
Has that been the highlight, do you think, or the high point of the administration of yours?
Well, we have a very broad responsibility of higher education and the cultural education area and vocational rehabilitation. I would say in the elementary and secondary education area, the combination of our concern for building quality standards and the competency tests and our program for registering the schools, strengthening that registration process, and our proposals in strengthening the quality of teaching. Those three things together, I think, have been the most significant changes that we've been able to make in the last 3 or 4 years.
Can you say, Commissioner, that a public school graduate in New York State, 1981 graduate, Regents graduate, is as good as a graduate in California or Washington or some other state in this country?
Oh, I think so. I think that if one looks at comparative statistics of our state and other states, one sees some very, very interesting results. We have 8% of the high school graduates of this entire country, 8% of them coming through New York. If you look at things like major competitions, the Westinghouse Science Talent Search, 35% of the national winners come from New York State. If you look at advanced placement, 20% of all the advanced placement work is done by those 8% who are in New York. If you look at merit scholarships, we get consistently about 15 to 18% of all the national merit scholarships. These are 8% of the children. If you look, I mentioned the SAT achievement or the aptitude test earlier. The achievement test for the highest performing students are on the specific subjects. New York State students are substantially above the rest of the country on those tests. We've got the evidence. There's just no question in my mind about the opportunities that secondary students have here and their level of performance compared with any other state in this country.
Voters these past few months have been lashing out again at proposed school budgets in various districts in our area, around the state, and around the country for that matter. A lot of people say, well, that's because the school budget is the only thing you can lash out at. What are the statistics this year? Have there been more rejections this year than, say, last year?
No, as a matter of fact, this year, the rate of passage of the budgets is better than it was last year. Rather than looking at the defeats, let me just turn it around. Practically 80% of all the school budgets were passed on the first time through across our state this year. Last year, the figure was about 70%.
What does that say to you?
Well, it says to me, to go back to the issue of confidence in education, it says to me that I think we have had an upturn in the confidence level. I think it also says that we have very sensitive school board members who are trying to read what it is that is a likely provable budget in their local school districts, and that means weighing off the tough decisions as to how much they can expand that budget or how much they have to hold the line. That's a large part of the issue of getting public confidence and then securing a vote on the budget. And I think it's also an indication of the fact that throughout the last 5 years in New York State, ever since the New York City fiscal crisis, we have had a level of very careful budget making, very prudent budget making across our local school districts. There were several years in our state where the net increases in local expenditures for education were running at the rate of about 3.5% or 4%, if you look at the state as a whole. They're higher than that this year because it's a catch-up. But still, I think we're in a mode here where there's a very prudent set of decisions being made on fiscal affairs, and I think that's reflected in what the voters have done on the budgets this year.
Let's look ahead a little bit. Priorities in the future. What new ideas, innovations that you might have in mind for the next couple of years? What are you looking to?
Well, we have, I think, in the area of elementary and secondary education in particular, one very, very severe problem. And that's the problem of the youth who, in fact, have dropped out of school and are unemployed. I'm thinking particularly about youth who are in our major cities, particularly about youth who are of minority background or youth who are in rural areas, rather remote. We have much, much too high of a rate of dropouts among these children. And if they drop out of secondary school, if they're not getting themselves equipped with fundamental skills, if they're not getting themselves equipped with job skills, then we know that the result for them and for our society is going to be almost a lifelong of dependency, of other costs that will come back on us from other social institutions.
What can you do, what can the department, what can the state do to attract these people back to school?
Well, one thing is to provide alternative educational programs, new modes, different modes. Another thing is to increase the level of contact with private industry. in cooperative programs for these children, so that in fact they're working part-time and they're studying part-time. So they see a real connection between their schoolwork and advancement on the job. Yet another approach, of course, is to provide much more substantial counseling and much better arrangements to try to help these persons into a mode of work, into a feeling that they can be successful, they have something to contribute, and that there's going to be a job and an opportunity if they carry through what is going to be, for a lot of them, the hard work of completing their education.
What is the dropout rate in New York? Is it different from any other area in the country?
No, not substantially. In fact, our aggregate dropout rate for the state is less than it is for the rest of the country. There's a very, very big difference here, though, between dropout rate in the suburban school districts and the small city school districts in the rural or the major cities. You get a much higher dropout rate in the rural areas and in the major cities. But if you're looking at suburban dropout rates, for example, in our state, oh, they're very, very slight. Almost 95% of children who enter the 10th grade complete high school.
It's that dropout in the rural areas and in the big cities that bothers you.
And yes, indeed, it does. In the major cities, if you take New York City, especially among minority populations, we are seeing a dropout rate which is more than 40%. That means that more than 40% of the children who reach 10th grade, 9th grade aren't completing high school among those populations. That's a terrible problem.
Final few moments. Any messages for our viewing audience that you'd like to get across that I didn't ask you?
Well, I think the general theme that I've been talking about on confidence, and the one more point on the importance of education for the economic development of the state of New York. We have tried very hard in 4 years to get those links established, to make sure that business and industry and public leaders understand how important education is as a drawing card for business in New York. It brings in families because they want their children to have a strong education. We have the research and development capacity in our universities to help support high technology. It's that connection and the importance of investment in education that's so much of a message that we're trying to convey.
Gordon Ambach, the New York State Commissioner of Education, our guest today on Face to Face. Thank you for joining us this past half hour, Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us also.
You have been watching Face to Face, an Action News Public Affairs presentation. This program was pre-recorded. George Layton speaking.